everyone, and welcome to this keynote address for the 2023 Center for Research Libraries annual meeting. We're so thrilled to have you with us for the Postcolonial Knowledge Commons, from call to action to community practice, an address from CRL President Greg Eow. The keynote today will be followed by a moderated discussion between Greg and Brian Vivier, chair of CRL's International Collections and Content Group, and as well as questions from all of you here today. CRL staff will be moderating the chat and asking your questions to the panelists. We'll share more on that following Greg's address. Please note that today's session is being recorded and will be shared afterward. For a bit of context, CRL, and in particular, CRL's International Collections and Content Group, ICCG, is in the process of facilitating a CRL-wide community conversation to create a shared understanding of the challenges and opportunities in CRL's global collections, programs, and services, the outcomes of which will be a roadmap that outlines a path forward for designing a CRL global collections and services program that aligns with community priorities. But without any further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. Greg Eow, President of the Center for Research Libraries, is responsible for setting strategic directions in overall CRL programming and services in collaboration with the Board of Directors, CRL staff, member libraries, and strategic partners. Before joining the Center for Research Libraries in 2019, he served as the Associate Director for Collections at the MIT Libraries, where he led an administrative portfolio that included scholarly communications and collection strategy, digital preservation, acquisitions and metadata, and the Institute Archives and Special Collections. Eow has held previous appointments as Charles Warren Bibliographer at the Harvard Library and Kaplanoff Librarian for American History at the Yale University Library. Eow currently serves on the management board of the MIT Press, the committee to visit the Harvard Library, and the board of directors of the Chicago Collections Consortium. He is a member of the American Historical Association. Brian Vivier leads area studies collections at the Penn Libraries, coordinating collection development in non-Western languages and overseeing the library's area studies departments. Brian serves on the Penn Library's Collection Development Council and represents global collections within the libraries and across campus, aiming to bring the distinctive contributions of area studies librarians and collections into the full range of the university's work. Trained in Chinese history, Brian is an adjunct associate professor of Chinese studies, teaching graduate seminars and serving on dissertation committees. Brian currently serves as chair of the International Collections and Content Group at the Center for Research Libraries, and as a member of the Council on East Asian Libraries Executive Board, the Bibliography of Asian Studies Advisory Committee, and the Society for Chinese Studies Librarians Executive Board. He is a book review editor for the Journal of Song-Yuan Studies. Before coming to Penn, Brian was the coordinator of public and information services for the Asia Library at the University of Michigan and special projects manager for Yale's East Asia Library. And so I very warmly welcome Greg Eow to join us. Greg?
Thank you so much, Felicia. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, wherever you may be joining us from. I'm thrilled to have the next 90 minutes to have a conversation about topics that are just the top of my passions when it comes to my professional life. Research libraries, research collections, global collections, knowledge commons. And it's going to be a really robust conversation, but maybe I'll just start off with the conclusion, because the conclusion is incredibly optimistic. The conclusion is this: research libraries working together not only have an opportunity to foster the creation of a more equitable global ecosystem for knowledge production, But research libraries have already laid the institutional framework for that knowledge commons and have been laying that framework for the last 60 years. And the opportunity before us now is to gather up all of these efforts that the research libraries have been laying the foundations for decades now, and bring them together so we can leverage those efforts at scale. The opportunity isn't theoretical. The opportunities existed for decades, and we've already made incredible progress to create the future we want to see. An open knowledge commons aligned with the values of research libraries, and knowledge commons that's equitable, global, diverse. The future is very, very, very bright. All right, as we get into it, I will just do a quick overview of what CRL is, because what CRL is as an organization is critical to understanding the opportunities that we have before us. So CRL is a place. It is a large research facility on the south side of Chicago, on the University of Chicago's campus. It is a collective collection. It is proof positive that research libraries can collaborate cooperatively across the network to cooperatively build, steward, and disseminate collections. It is now 74 years old, and as I was talking about at our annual meeting yesterday, next year's CRL 75th anniversary, it is proof positive that research librarians can build collections at the cooperative level. Collective action works. And CRL is also an association, a community. Maybe a way to think about this is maybe to think about what CRL is not. CRL is certainly not a commercial vendor, but neither is CRL a nonprofit entity that has a vendor business model. We are a pure cooperative where every member pays a cost share based on the size of their collection budget and participates in a governance structure such that CRL is a cooperative owned and governed by the community. We're a .edu. We are part of the Knowledge Commons. And understanding what CRL is really important to understanding the opportunity we have to come together and leverage this extraordinary organization, this network, to build the knowledge commons that we want to see. All right, so the topics today, I'm going to talk about crisis, contextualizing crisis, and really situating narratives of crisis in contextualizing print, economies of print, the print as a format, print as a vehicle for knowledge exchange. After we talk about crisis and situating print in that crisis, talk about post-coloniality and global collecting, and really talking about how a post-colonial framework can turn some of this crisis narrative into opportunities to move forward rather than a crisis, but actually a framework that offers that's generative and forward-looking, and rather than seeing our world as one shot through with crisis, one that's much more importantly shot through with opportunity. And then three, we're going to talk about the process of coming together as a community, taking stock of what our aspirations are in terms of building global collections and services, in the process that we're going to undertake over the next few months to understand the opportunity space as a community and design a community framework for how we move together as a community to build that knowledge commons. But before I talk about all the opportunities and end on that super positive note, which I believe is based on institutional and conceptual reality, it's optimism that's very, very well founded, I really want to talk about crisis. Crisis, sense of crisis, decline, narratives of loss, narratives of declension. Because I will say this, I graduated from library school in 1998, and I did a PhD in history in 2007. And I am at the point of my career where I have more years in my profession behind me now than I have ahead of me. And it occurs to me that I have never had a moment, not in library school, not in graduate school, not in any moment in my working life that has not been defined by crisis. In library school, it was the cereals crisis, that the price of cereals and the price of resources was far outpacing the growth of library budgets. The cereals crisis. As an historian, it was always the crisis of the humanities and this narrative of loss and de-investment in the humanities. A crisis in the humanities that over the last 10 years seems to be picking up pace and is becoming very, very acute just in the last 10 years, where enrollment drop-offs are, we're seeing it as high as 50, 80% in some places. but this whole narrative lost. And where is this coming from? And what does this look like? So in 2010, my mentor, Dan Hazen, who is the head of collections at Harvard Library, he wrote an internal policy report on library collections in the wake of the financial crisis. And in this paper, there's this incredible quote. Dan writes, faltering budgets compound an intensifying existential crisis resulting from profound shifts in information, scholarship, technology, and academic organizations. Profound shifts in information, scholarship, technology, and academic organizations. Libraries are on uncertain ground as they engage with this fractious, seductive, alien, and essential universe. Alien. This was not a theoretical journal article. This was not a theoretical monograph. This was an internal policy report. And he's talking about an alien landscape. That's the level of disruption, right? Profound shifts in information, scholarship, technology, and academic organizations. And he describes collections as being especially uncertain. Later in 2015, John Palfrey, he was the head of the Harvard Library, but he's now head of the MacArthur Foundation, where I am here in Chicago. He wrote Bibliotech, which was directed not so much at research libraries, but all libraries. And he has an extraordinary quote worth reflecting on. Palfrey writes, the changes wrought by the digital revolution add up to a perfect storm for libraries and librarians. This perfect storm is so terrifying because the role that many librarians have seen for themselves historically is not a great fit for the current era. So there we have, John Palfrey and Dan Hazen. These are not writers prone to exaggeration or hyperbole. We have an internal policy report, a committee memo, essentially, and then this bibliotech, and they're using words like alien, profound shifts, terrifying. So what is going on here, right? This whole decline, what is this narrative of loss and crisis and fear? What is going on? And as I've really ruminated on this and tried to get purchase on the context, really think this has to do with a format change, right? A format change, an economic change, very similar to what happened in the 15th and 16th centuries with a new technology change and a format change, which was the coming of print, right? And so I think the classic books on the coming of print and the disruptions caused by the coming of print is still Eisenstein's The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. And in Eisenstein's work, she talks about how, as an agent of change, printing altered methods of data collection, storage and retrieval systems, and communication networks. So it's not a format change. So going from script to print, being able to use the printing press, right? For Gutenberg, no one knows when the printing press was invented, 1450, thereabouts, 1450. So that format change and that technology change, it's not just a format change, it was a complete revolution in the economies of knowledge production. So entire institutions that have been economies, professions that have been created around the production of script-based knowledge sharing and dissemination was completely disrupted. And the entire knowledge economy was disrupted by the coming of print. And it was pretty much a hot mess. How do you actually create printing? How do you actually create a printing press with viable economic models? How do you do that? What should a book look like, right? It took centuries to sort of get this sorted out. So if you say, 1500s, early 1500s, you have all this minutiae and Venice experimenting with creating portable early sort of paperback volumes of classic works of antiquity, which was great for scholars. But also in the 15th century, you have the printing press being used, to use contemporary parlance, to be a dissemination tool for what would be called, hate speech and fake news. It was an incredible mess. The whole knowledge economy and and that being awash in knowledge and being and trying to figure out what's credible knowledge versus just fake news and hate speech. This is where the work of his Harvard historian Ann Blair is fabulous. The Too Much to Know. This is when scholars create reference books and reference systems to be able to manage these oceans of print and to be able to separate credible knowledge from, I guess, fake news. That's all happening in the 15th century. In the 1600s, you have the creation of the Royal Society and the first scientific journal, the creation of peer review, right? It's all creating the institutional structures and economic structures to make sense of this entire shift in the economies of knowledge production and sharing. And the apotheosis of this institutional and economic edifice to accommodate print as a knowledge of exchange, the apotheosis of this is the creation of the modern research university, based on that German model, but disseminated globally, and something very, very familiar to us, working in North America. But the creation of the modern research university, and the argument of Chad Wellman and organizing enlightenment, information overload, and the invention of the modern research university was designed to be able to create authoritative, reliable ways to make sense of this overload of information. And so this creation of the modern research university, how disciplines are created, the different disciplinary traditions, the scholarly societies, American Historical Association, Modern Language Association, professionalization, the creation of the American Library Association, all of these different efforts to professionalize and to create disciplines was all sort of the apogee and the apotheosis of this creation, this multi-century long creation to create this print-based, make sense of this print medium. And then I would argue that around 1950, we start moving into a post-print age. Not that print goes away, obviously, print is never going to go away, but it starts to share space with a new technology, just as print was a new technology in the 1450s, a new technology, computational methods, electronic methods of generating knowledge and sharing knowledge, is devised. So the digital revolution is not the 90s and the World Wide Web. The digital revolution is 1945, 1950, thereabouts. And this is where you have Vannevar Bush creating a conception, or basically outlining the modern internet, 1945. This is where you have Marshall McLuhan, articulating that we're post-Gutenberg. He's not thinking of the internet, he's talking about television. He talks about how television is creating this post-print world, like a new orality. So rather than relying on text, we're going to go back to a free-text environment where we're relying on sort of oral exchange of information. So that's Marshall McLuhan. It's fascinating to me, just as a side note, how Marshall McLuhan is, it's hard to imagine how prominent he was in the 60s and 70s. He even had that cameo in Woody Allen's Annie Hall. But Marshall McLuhan was talking about this print shift, in the 60s and 70s, and was nearly ubiquitous. And J.C.R. Licklider, who was a computational scientist, a computer scientist at MIT, had this terrific book, Libraries of the Future, which really, if you read it today, it really would read like any current report on the libraries of the future, because this post-print era really dates to the 1950s. And I would argue that as this post-print era was becoming a economic and institutional reality, it changed how research libraries operated. How research libraries operated really started to change meaningfully at this transition point, right? This transition from print to digital media. One was, how do you manage print, right? So you have these oceans of print, right? This oceans of print, and Wellman's argument, the entire modern research enterprise was created as a bureaucracy to be able to right size and manage and efficiently accommodate knowledge production in these oceans of print. Well, in this post-print age, you start seeing a real focus on collaborative post or beyond the network level information management. So the Farmington Plan right? Farmington Plan, early 40s, arguing that we should be working across institutional context to build collections, cooperative collection development. The creation of CRL as a shared print repository in 1949, that timing is certainly not an accident. It's right there in that as that changing space from going from a print world to a digital world. We're not going to build massive local print collections. We really need to start working across the network and sharing resources collaboratively to build to manage these collections in ways that are efficient and sustainable. Research libraries were really ahead of this. You have the creation of OCLC in 1967. How do we share cataloging records? How do we share intelligence to be able to manage shared resources at the network scale? Research libraries have been laying the foundation for this cooperative effort, this knowledge commons for decades. We're really good at it, right? So this is creating a new level of cooperation as we move into this post-print environment. So that's one move. The digital move is really, really, really vexed. And what I would argue is that in a digital world, libraries are torn. We are forked. We have a forked digital path. And I think this book, Matthew David and Sharing Crime Against Capitalism, really captures the reality of research libraries and the forked path we navigate in a digital space. It's not a digital revolution, it's two digital revolutions. One digital revolution, e-resources, authentication, right? Serials crisis, locking down, right? So you have a digital revolution, and it's a digital revolution to lock down access to content. We're, all of our e-resources librarians, all of our librarians working in Neural, this is where they spend their time trying to unlock that content, right? That's one part of the fork path. The other fork path is open access, open repositories, open digital collections, and research libraries are certainly very, very active in that space. But as we get into this digital world, right, this post-print world, it's a focus on collaboration at the network level, certainly for print, and then trying to create a digital environment that aligns with our values, certainly trying to find ways to cooperate to build an open knowledge commons in a digital space, and then trying to unlock the areas that are being locked down. I'm not going to concentrate on efforts that we've made as a research library community to address the serials crisis. We can certainly talk about it, but I'll highlight efforts that we've made, successful efforts that we've been making as a research library community to build an open digital ecosystem. So you have the creation of JSTOR, 1994. You have the creation of SPARC, Open Access Advocacy Group, 1998. You have HashiTrust, which is just such an incredible achievement of the research library community to build an open commons. You have the Coalition of Open Access Repositories, CORE, that global group that is bringing a global focus to the institutional repository and open access movement with a real focus on the Global South. That's an organization I'm passionate about. And then just last fall, you had the release here in the United States from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Alondra Nelson memo, that makes the case that all federally funded research in the US needs to be open access on repositories, right? So we have this digital path to open. It's navigating this forked path, but we're making a lot of progress in this post-print world to build an open knowledge commons. Right. So I'm going to move and talk about post-coloniality and global collections, but just a quick recap. A lot of the narrative of decline and crisis and loss, I would argue, is due to the institutional stresses or the institutional breakdown of institutions that were designed for a knowledge economy that is no longer primary. It would be wrong to say that print doesn't exist or it's not important. Obviously it exists. It will continue to exist. But it is not driving the knowledge economy as it once did. And so the institutional framework, including the disciplinary structures of the modern university are stressed, and they need to be rethought to accommodate this new environment. But I'd like to argue that using a post-colonial framework, rather than looking at the declension of institutions that were created for a former print paradigm and seeing that as a narrative of loss, because it is, but it's far more importantly and lastingly an opportunity to remake those structures, build on all of the achievements of those institutions, whether you call it Renaissance, scientific, revolution, enlightenment. We can build on the extraordinary achievements of that institutional information economy, institutional structure, but we can remake it in a way that builds on it, but also undoes some of the incredible failings and limitations of that institutional structure. I don't look at that structure with nostalgia. I want to build on it and build something better, right? So let's talk about post-coloniality and global collecting. So David Scott is an anthropologist at Columbia, and I've just found it so rich and generative to just engage with his thinking and his work on post-coloniality. He's from Jamaica, but his early work was done on Sri Lanka, and he's just done some incredible work really theorizing post-coloniality. And this one quote I just come back to again and again and again, and he describes this post-colonial condition, not crisis, but condition, as we inhabit a moment of crisis, but it's also a moment of possibilities. The old options are widely felt to be unattractive, like those institutional structures, right? But we don't have the new structures in place yet. So we can see this as a moment of loss or confusion, but I see it one as opportunity, and that's the post-colonial condition. And when I think about the achievements, the considerable achievements of that print-based knowledge economy, I also think of the extraordinary limitations in that entire knowledge economy. And when you think about that bookended time frame, the periodization of print, 1450 thereabouts to 1950 thereabouts, surely it's not lost on any of us that in terms of periodization, that's entirely conterminous with European imperial expansion and settler colonialism. So all of the incredible achievements of that knowledge economy, and those achievements are miraculous and something that we can all take claim to as a human inheritance. It is shot through with inequality and shot through with lack of attribution. And the scholarship talking about indigenous contributions to knowledge creation that was not attributed and not acknowledged, is that the scholarship on this is robust. But for the sake of efficiency, I'll just point to this one synthesizing work that came out just last year. It's a terrific work of synthesis by James Poskett, Horizons, the Global Origins of Modern Science. He really lays out the case, example after example, of indigenous and global contributions to the knowledge economy of print, and how, for all sorts of reasons related to imperialism, settler colonialism, these contributions have just been erased and not acknowledged. And as we look to build a new knowledge commons, something better than what we had in the past, build something better than we had in the past, we really need to acknowledge that the achievements of that knowledge economy was truly global in ways that have never been recognized. This book is really terrific. And we really need to think capaciously about being truly inclusive at a global level, really having sensitivity to legacies of power, dominion, inequality, marginalization as we build this new knowledge commons. I talked about the achievements that we've had building these collaborative efforts, both in print, but also in digital frameworks. But I would argue that we as research librarians and we as institutions, working in institutions dedicated to knowledge production, have not done a sufficient job of understanding how these legacies of inequality and structural inequalities are playing out in ways that aren't just unequal and just not right, but actually creates an epistemological problem where we actually don't know as much as we would otherwise know because we're not being as inclusive as we could be. So there are areas where markets work very, very, very well. I am working on a ThinkPad. I am using PowerPoint. I could not get through any moment of my day without relying on the incredible achievements of the commercial sector. I have no problems with the power of markets, and as my day-to-day life is an exemplar. But there are areas where markets do not work, and knowledge production is one of them. Markets work astoundingly well at producing and delivering an ever-expanding variety of novels, textbooks, children's books for affluent English speakers. This is a terrific book, Leah Shaver, Ending Book Hunger. Markets work really well at rewarding those that can afford it. So if you're rich, the market's going to reward you. If you have a large market, the market will reward you. If you're a small market but you're rich, you're going to get a robust Dutch publishing industry. If you have a large population but you're not rich, you're not going to get a strong, publishing industry. Markets work really, really well. They don't work so great in the knowledge economy, and that's why the nonprofit sector has to be active in this space. Building on Leah Shaver's work, this is an epistemological failing. So 22% of languages account for 83% of publishing. That's now. There's estimated to be 7,000 languages in use, nearly all with writing systems, but that's only 1/100 have viable publishing industries. So if we want to build a healthy knowledge economy, if we want to create a healthy environment that is producing knowledge in ways that are efficient and effective, we have to recognize in a really full-throated way these systems of inequality and profound market failure. Again, I'm not anti-market, but this is just market failure, right? Let's talk about area studies. The area of research libraries and research librarians, the expertise that we have in our libraries, in our archives, in our settings on campus, the area studies librarians, they know all of this. When I was talking about this, they know all this because they spend their careers building collections in global partnerships, focusing on collections that would otherwise be marginalized or erased or invisible. And they spend their time building incredible collections and services and partnerships that are building that open knowledge commons. The area studies community is a community that has had incredible achievements, but I'm getting ahead of myself. What is area studies? What is area studies? So area studies is part of that post-colonial framework. So it's a conceptual framework and it's an institutional framework that was created, let's say, post-Cold War period, largely the United States, North America. It was created in the post-war period as part and parcel of Cold War policy and politics. So as the United States was involved in all sorts of different international relations and foreign engagements, so you needed to have scholars and students that were learning languages that would be useful for the Cold War efforts. And so area studies funding, Title VI funding, and the creation of different Title VI centers across our institutional frameworks was funding all sorts of area studies activities. CRL is part and parcel of this. So building collections that would support area studies scholarship, support language learning, related to area studies scholarship. It really was an institutional and conceptual framework born of that, the post-war period. in the area studies framework and the achievements of that conceptual and institutional creation are immense. It was immensely fecund and an incredibly productive and generative framework. The work of Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities, James Scott, Weapons of the Weak, Mary Douglas. I mean, just the achievements of the area studies framework is enormous. But 1989, fall of the Cold War, as an institutional, as a conceptual framework, started really showing cracks. And as an institutional framework and a funding framework, since 1989 has been in steady decline, right? Related to government funding in Title VI. So since 1989, all of the achievements of area studies, that profound global focus, that focus to partnerships and creating equitable knowledge, economies, the institutional framework of that. Actually, I'm going to stop and acknowledge that I am in a tower in Chicago, and we're all going to get a little show here as they're doing window washing behind me. So we're going to have a little real-time interactive show behind me as I'm on the 32nd floor. But anyway, that notwithstanding. So as the area studies framework was showing cracks, there were a series of conversations to say, hey, what is the future of area studies? Because this work has to continue. But the institutional framework is starting to break down. What do we do? In 1997, there was a Future of Area Studies conference at Indiana University. I have some quotes here capturing some of the takeaways from that event. The third quote really jumped out at me because it says the Center for Research Library should catalog all of these collections, and our AMPS, our Area Studies microfilm projects at CRL should be doing this. That was in 1997. That's exactly right. And that's some of the work that we've been doing over the last year with our shared stewardship group. The time has come for this. More recently, in 2013, CRL, with Mellon funding, sponsored an event at Duke University where Dan Hazen and Deborah Jacobs were leaders. Bernie Riley was a leader, then president of CRL, was a leader. And they had this conference at Duke to really imagine what area studies could look like. And they really talk about going from an area studies conceptual and institutional framework to more of a global collections framework. And part of this was the breakdown in the institutional support of area studies. It was in 2010 where the institutional framework for area studies, the Title VI funding at the federal level really started to collapse at the institutional level. So in FY10, the funding for area studies through Title VI was $110 million, and FY22 is $71 million. And so this conference in 2013 was right in the context of that institutional breakdown in terms of funding for area studies. And so this paper, or the conference and the resulting paper from the Global Dimensions of Scholarship and Research Libraries Forum really was making the full-throated case of going from an area studies framework to a global studies framework, and adopting a forward-looking posture to global studies and really emphasizing a move to digital frameworks. And this quote here is actually really, really timely. Felicia mentioned that I'm a member of the American Historical Association, and I will always identify as an historian. And just last week, I got my most recent copy of the American Historical Review. And as luck would have it, the special topic of the current issue of the American Historical Review is on transnational and international history. Again, trying to move from that area studies framework to a global studies framework. And this issue, the current issue of the American Historical Review, has a series of 12 essays from maybe early to mid-career scholars. And they all write sort of personal narratives about how the institutional framework around area studies is actually getting in the way of their scholarship, and how in their work, they are constantly bumping up against the limitations of former institutional frameworks, right? So what I'd argue is that the area studies conceptually, the conceptual framework, and the institutional support around it has been steadily breaking down since 1989. And we're at the point now where we really need to develop a administrative and institutional structure to align with where we are now and where we're going. At CRL, this most immediately refers to all of the different global collections groups that we sponsor and we host at CRL. I'll look at, these are a long list of groups. The Africana America, the Cooperative Africana Americans Project Group, the Camp Group, they've been at CRL since 1964. And these groups, I believe, are just the core of what CRL has been and will be. These are groups where international, experts, scholar experts, linguistic experts are working collaboratively to build collections, print-based and digital-based. And their expertise are absolutely essential to the knowledge commons we want to build. But the challenge we have is that they're organized, this work is organized in administrative frameworks that are dated to a context and a time frame that is no more, right? Here's a list. This is not supposed to be legible. This is supposed to be just illustrative of all the different organizations represented in these global programs. And in a very immediate sense, this is just in a CRL context, when we have these administrative structures that were designed for a context that is no more, we pay a lot of costs as a community. So the experts working in these global collections groups, in these administrative structures that are siloed from each other and then siloed from other parts of the CRL community, it really leads to missed opportunities for collective action. All of these groups are keen to build, to have a unified voice in terms of licensing, right? Access, pushing back against the closed down digital ecosystem, wanting to have a digital infrastructure. So they want to have a shared infrastructure to build a shared knowledge commons, but they need to do that across groups and across the CRL community. So we're not, so we can leverage our scale. They want to expand memberships and have many more global partnerships, and that's frustrated because we're broken up into these siloed administrative units rather than having being able to have a unified global membership program. Internally, sort of back of office operations at CRL, the back of office operations are sort of have their plates more than full, accommodating all the various workflows related to having a large number of siloed groups. And then also this structure does create risk for the organization, for CRL, just in terms of being able to follow through with best practices with our annual audit and our 990 form, and we can talk more about that if of interest. But the takeaway here is that the administrative structures that were designed to an age that is no more is holding us all back, whether it's curators working in area studies groups, whether it's staff working to accommodate the activities of those groups, or senior administrators just trying to keep the organization running. The design of the mousetrap, the administrative design, needs to be rethought so that we can be more impactful together. All right. So I talked about sort of the contextualizing crisis, this narrative of crisis in the context of the breakdown in a print knowledge economy. Talked about how adopting a post-colonial framework could really look at the current breakdown or the current ambiguity as an opportunity for, as more of an opportunity than as a narrative of loss, an opportunity that is no more or no less than to build on all of the achievements of the Enlightenment knowledge economy, but do better and create something that's much more inclusive and effective and equitable. Okay, but how are we actually going to do this, like in real steps over the next few months? Well, When I came to CRL, I wanted to make sure that everything we did aligned with community priorities. And so in my first year, working with our collections policy group, we did a survey. We sent out a survey to all the CRL membership and said, when you think of CRL, what do you need CRL to do? What is your priority for CRL? And the answer we got back from that survey was emphatic. Global collections. If CRL does anything, CRL needs to be a hub for building and stewarding and sharing global collections. Full stop. Clear as a bell, message received. Based on that feedback, the Collection Services and Policy Committee created a subcommittee, the International Collections and Content Group, to really give us, to bring together real experts in the area studies or global collections community and really empower that committee to be guiding CRL's global collections strategy and operations and resource allocation. And one of the first things that the International Collections and Content Group did was they sent out a survey surveying all of those experts working in those area studies or global collections programs that CRL hosts, asking them, what do they need? You know, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? What do you need to do your work? And then we got the results from the call to action. And then based on that, the results of the call to action, we were moving into the next few months working through a process of bringing all of our stakeholders across the CRL together to define our collective global collection strategy and resource allocation. This slide here just reiterates the process. The CSPC survey, CRL members, what's your priority? International collections. We create the International Collections and Content Group. They issue their survey to our area studies groups, global collections groups, asking them for their feedback and their priorities. And I want to spend a little time talking about what we heard from our area studies experts, our global collections experts through that call to action. Because I know I've spent a lot of time reading and reflecting on what that call to action revealed. Because some of it, to be honest with you, is really poignant. So the challenges that these area studies global collections experts, and they are experts, and I've been going on a listening tour and meeting with them. These are scholars of the first rate. These are collections experts of the first rate, and we need to empower these groups. And the challenges that these groups are facing are capacity. They're getting defunded, while the need for their expertise and the need for their impact grows. And you can see that in that institutional funding, that Title VI funding. You can see that institutional framework just disappearing. They need capacity. Their work is more essential than ever, and the capacity is not there. Advocacy. When I say poignant, this is what's poignant to me. They said they don't believe that senior administrators and resource allocators understand their work. Or that their work is being supported. And they're right, it's not. Their work is happening at the margins, and it's some of the most important work in the field, and we need to bring it to the center, and we need to support it at the center. We can't build a post-colonial knowledge commons just building shared print and building HathiTrust. We need the area studies and the international experts front and center if we're going to get this right. And so the advocacy part of the call to action is what resonates with me and stays with me over and over and over again. They need decision makers, they need attention, they need to be at the center of what we do. Linguistic expertise, you saw that statistic where there's 7,000 plus languages, and the Anglophone world is just driving, just driving the knowledge economy, and that just won't do. And the area studies experts know this more than anybody. And we need to center their expertise. And they need funding. They need funding. All right, the opportunities. These experts understand the inequities in the global knowledge economy. They've been living it for 60 years. They have expertise, they have partnerships, and they want to build an equitable knowledge commons. They want to build an open access model. I'm thinking of SAWA. This community knows what needs to be done, and they've demonstrated that they can build it. The SAWA is just one example, but they know what needs to happen, and they have a whole framework around post-custodial and non-extractive ways of building collections. The way that we're building collections, and area studies had huge achievements, but it was an extractive model, that Cold War model. Let's go around the world and extract resources and put it at CRL. And that's not the model going forward. And nobody wants to do that model going forward. And our area studies experts, our global collections experts know the models, the ethical models of ways to build collections and partnerships. Area studies librarians don't want to go on buying trips. They want to they want to go on partnership trips. That's what I learned when I most forcefully when I was spending time at the camp meeting. These are really experts. We need to support them. So the Educopia initiative, this is designed to bring together the entire CRL community to put the needs of the area studies community, our global collections community, the call to action, the call to action results, to put this community and their needs, their aspirations and their needs, their challenges and their aspirations front and center for all of CRL, because that's what CRL needs to do. And we are going to bring together representatives from our area studies community, also CRL staff that understand the back of office limitations and the capacity, and then also deans, the board of directors and deans, the decision makers, the resource allocators, and bring these different stakeholder groups in conversation, force them to talk to each other, force them to build a shared understanding of what the problem space is and what the opportunity space is. And then working together, we will build a shared roadmap for what CRL's global collections mission is and administrative structures are to empower that. But this process is meant to empower everything that is working right and has always worked well in that area studies framework. We're just going to reorganize the administrative structure to support and amplify that expertise. This is not stepping away from it. It is just recreating the administrative structures to support it. So the topics today were contextualizing crisis, situating print. Yes, we can look at the breakdown of the print knowledge economy, and we can talk about this as a narrative of loss, and we can center nostalgia and try to wrap our hands around it and hold on. I'm an historian. I understand seeing institutional, loss and existential crisis. But using a post-colonial framework, I really see that this is actually, the sense of loss is actually really, the ambiguity of the moment is really one filled with much more opportunity. We can actually build on all the achievements of the former institutional frameworks for knowledge production. We can build something so much better. And the community recalibration process that we're working with Educopia is going to center CRL to be at scale where we advance all of the values and missions and everything that's great about area studies, even if we call it something different. But that's what we're going to do, because that's what CRL is uniquely positioned to do. So with that, thank you so much for your time. And we have more than a half hour just to have a conversation together. And let's just have a wonderful conversation, because we're all in this together. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And thank you everyone in those area studies groups. Your labor is seen and it's appreciated.
Thank you so very much, Greg. And I know there's tons of applause popping up. So thank you to all of our audience for being present with us. And thank you for those wonderful remarks, Greg. Again, we have the Q&A box set up. If you have any questions you'd like to field to Greg and Brian, please drop those in that Q&A box now. But in the meantime, I'm happy to welcome Brian Vivier to get the conversation started. Brian, Greg?
Thanks a lot, Felicia, and thank you very much, Greg. I know that the International Collections Content Group urged you to do this keynote, and I'm really glad that you have put your thinking out there for us all to engage with. I can see already that the Q&A box is filling up, so I don't want to take all of the air of the time, but I will kick off with a comment and a question, perhaps clichely. As you've noted, we're both trained as historians, and so one can't help but think about how you framed your keynote in a historical context. You've made a lot about a historic arc and about formats. And of course, as someone who has never worked on Europe, it's interesting to think about your narrative of print. And my comment is that I would challenge you in a both positive, I guess, a challenging and an opening way, that this narrative over hundreds or thousands of years around formats looks very different from other parts of the world, other languages, other cultures. And I think that also presents opportunities in how we might think. And so, I think we may be able to get into this over the course of the next half hour, but I'm always interested in continuities as well, or themes and values that unite things across ages. And, when I think about even just the history of printing, and, where it's disruptive and where it isn't, not everything is revolutionary in the end. Then we can come back and around that if that's useful. But the thing I wanted to ask about, and I think that one of the things that many of us are most curious about, is how you see CRL's position given its uniqueness. I've been thinking about a lot about what is special about CRL, and the ways in which we depend on it and the ways that we've looked to it, which that call to action survey really showed. And I can see already the questions involve a lot around advocacy, which I'd also be happy to get into. But CRL is unique, and it is a single institution. There's nothing else like it. It's an academic, as you said, it's a .edu address, but it's not a university. It's not a school. And it's unique in its centrality to international and area studies collections, I would argue. And so I'd like to kind of push you for your reflections on how you see the opportunities and the challenges of that unique position, how you plan to, how in your vision for this kind of a post-colonial moment in collection development and research support, how that uniqueness plays out. And to some degree, given the uniqueness of CRL, what are the things that CRL depends on from the broader networks that are engaged with it at that unique position?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Brian. It's a really essential question. And I think one of the, and I appreciate the chance to talk about it. I think one of the things that's always been a challenge for me over my career, as I was trying to make my way as a librarian, was that it's a really crowded space, right? So usually you work in an institution, and then you're trying to make sense of like this larger world. There's ARL and ACRL and Spark and CNI, and oh my goodness, there's just this whole, just this whole constellation of groups. And so, like, how do you make sense of that space? And I think so when we say that, CRL is unique or nearly unique, every organization is unique, but what do we mean here? Because with CRL, it's something very, very particular. CRL is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. And it's essential for this reason. It's an association. And what do I mean by association? An association means it's governed by the members. So ARL is an association, ACRL is association. You pay dues, you vote, the board of directors, the members govern the organization. CRL has an association governance structure. But unlike basically any association I know, we're also an actual collection. We're actually an operational, we're a shared collection. We're a research library. So we're a research library that's a co-op and governed by this association governance model. What this means is that we're a nonprofit owned and run by the member libraries. And it's independent. We're not part of a larger institution. HathiTrust, I love HathiTrust. It's part of University of Michigan. So ultimately, it is part of University of Michigan with a lot of autonomy, obviously. But CRL is completely standalone. We file our own 990, and basically, our members can do whatever we like as long as we don't run afoul of state of Illinois and the U.S. federal government, right? So we are just research libraries. We're a cooperative at scale. And certainly folks know, we're not commercial, we're not a vendor, but this is something that's a nuance. I want to riff on this because it took me a long time to figure this out myself. So maybe this will help others. If they, maybe. Oftentimes nonprofits that I'm a fan of will be nonprofits, but they will have a vendor service model. And if you're a nonprofit with a vendor service model, that does have cultural implication and ways of being. So OCLC is a nonprofit with a vendor service model. And oftentimes you see this friction, cultural and otherwise, with the research library community. That's not because OCLC, is this, that, and the other thing. They're a nonprofit that has a vendor service model. There are other nonprofits that have vendor service models. CRL is a nonprofit governed by the members with that association governance model, and we don't have a vendor service model. We're a pure co-op. And what that means is that we can be that post-colonial knowledge commons, a true commons. The challenge though, Brian, is that vendors, they can demonstrate ROI. This is what we're selling you, and if you don't like it, don't buy it. So they can always do ROI. For CRL, it's a little bit harder to sell that because we're selling some ROI, cost savings, whatnot. But at the end of the day, we're a co-op, right? So it's like when I fund the shared fitness center in my condo, I'm not asking them the same questions on ROI as I would if I joined Equinox, right? So it's a little bit different. So I think the opportunity is to us to leverage us as a co-op. But the challenge is that we're really a co-op. So you need to sort of treat us as a co-op, not a vendor. I feel like I'm going long, but you asked something that I think is super important.
Well, I think there's, you could give a whole other talk around these questions. So I don't want to, we already have a bunch of questions coming in. There are a bunch of other things I can bring up, but I'm happy to turn to the wonderfully rich audience that we have here today.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I think we can pop back and forth. I know you have some more wonderful questions to share as well. Our first question from the audience: how do you maintain a focus on deep regional knowledge and language learning that characterizes area studies within a reframing of global or transnational engagement that is the administrative language of the contemporary university, which you seem to be advocating, without reaffirming the hegemony of European languages and colonial presumptions and epistemologies?
I'm just going to read this. I mean, I don't like to respond quick because I want to be thoughtful. So just and Brian, you can jump in. So I'm going to read this.
Sure. I mean, I could talk a little bit about how I articulate this. I feel like many of us here today, I'm in dialogue with administrators who are not focused on area studies, and I'm trying to advocate for international area studies, global collections, from a position of values. The way that I talk about this is to emphasize our investment in individual voices. The crucial thing for me and the way I think about the best of area studies values is our investment in the local, the human, the particular, that our investment as librarians is in what individual people think, read, write, say, play, dance, make in all their dimensions. And so I'm trying to put that at the center. So that doesn't have to be in a kind of area studies framework, that we divide the world into areas, and especially we do not think with the unit of the nation state as the central organizing idea, which I think has been true of a lot of past practice, but rather to think flexibly around flows, connections. I think the transnational is really helpful for us, so long as we keep individual voices at the center. That's how I try to talk about it. I do put it directly in opposition with what I think of as a lot of the discourses of globality, as I see them practiced, which as I think this is from Judith. Judith notes that there's a flattening, a universality, and it's not just centering Europe in America, right? It's centering English, the idea of a global language in which value is conveyed in the world. And I'm trying to make a values-based argument, which oftentimes goes hand in hand, I find, with I'm pleased at the surge of interest in universities around language of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and social justice. And I think that our work has always made a major contribution to those areas. And I'm very happy to put that to the forefront, and to use some of that administrative language and fill it with the values that we hold dear.
Yeah.
And now I'm going along.
That was, yeah. Just want to hear you. I would love to. We need to have another forum. We'll do a forum. We have everyone in person and do a forum. That's what we need to do. But to answer the first question, look, I'm just going to answer it like an administrator. So I really see it as an administrative question, in a matter of, so when you look at our different area studies groups now, we're trying to hit the balance between, so how do we design something that's going to be efficient and effective from an administrative perspective? So that could look at some flattening and some centralization, because right now I think we're just from an administrative logistical point of view, it's just we have too much siloing. So I think as we create groupings that are less siloed and flattened, right? We want to leverage the benefits of some level of a shift towards centralization, right? Because it's a pendulum, right? It's pros and cons all the way, right? So I think we need to find some ways, we need to leverage some level of flattening, but we do need to be really attuned to, the more you flatten, the more you run the risk of losing that local deep expertise, right? And I really heard this loud and clear when I went on my listening tour and engaged with different VM groups, especially when with SEAM, Southeast Asian Material Project. And they said, look, we got a good thing going here. This is one of the only places we get together and really focus on Southeast Asia. And if we do some flattening, don't you just put us in with South Asia and East Asia, because we have particular interests. So I'm not really thinking about how that flattening would reify, Western hegemony. I'm really thinking about this as in a South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia framework. So I do think we need to find some efficiencies and benefits of some level of centralization, but we need to always be aware of this cautionary tale that flattening could run the risk of running roughshod over local knowledge. And that's just something we're gonna have to navigate together. The next question is about how can science, health, and STEM get involved? All right, so this is a great question. And Brian, I wanna hear what your thoughts are, but I'll tell you, my thinking about this shift from area studies to global studies and global engagement, I really thought a lot about this, and really, well, I had to unlearn a bunch and learn a bunch when I went from Harvard to MIT, because when I was at Yale and Harvard, I understood sort of the area studies framework because I was in these departments, or I worked very closely with area studies librarians. So I was part of those communities. It was familiar. Oftentimes I had personal relationships, and that was my world, area studies. And it was a pretty darn big world because it was pretty capacious. But when I got to MIT, I kind of had my head blown because there was really no area studies to speak of. They had a great Aga Khan program, but there really was no area studies as area studies at MIT. But when I looked at what was happening in the business school on engagement in Africa, when I looked at what was happening in computer science and artificial intelligence in Africa, AI in Africa, I really saw all sorts of activities related to collections and services that really weren't on my mental map at all, using an area studies framework, or at least what I understood as my area studies, that really needed to be included. So I just see, as part of rethinking this institutional framework, I just think we have allies and folks to collaborate with that we haven't even thought of before. And where I really unlearned things or learned things was really looking at what was happening at the MIT Sloan School of Business, particularly the Poverty Action Lab. Esther DeFlo, Poverty Action Lab. Does that fit into area studies or not? They're doing amazing work. So anyway, I think it's a great question. What do you think, Brian?
So I think about this a lot too. I'm at an institution here at the University of Pennsylvania in which professional schools are very important. And I can just mostly second what Greg is saying about the opportunities to partner with people in professional schools who do have international engagements. I think one of the things I try to do as a librarian is to insert, again, that emphasis on the local and the individual as a kind of friction maker in this kind of universalizing global approach. Something that we talk a little more about. I've also been inspired by the work of Anna Tsing on questions of scalability and non-scalability, and a lot of the things I'm trying to think about with library practice. I've been inspired by that. But when I think about engaging with professional schools and these far-reaching, these far-reaching projects that often have a kind of neo-colonial taste to them, in whatever form, trying to use questions about what can be ethically scaled and what cannot be ethically scaled as a way to make a challenge. But when it comes to like the core question around STEM, as asked, a lot of my thinking was really shaped by Reggie Raju's Diversity as Knowledge lecture for CRL. I guess that was just last year. And his argument for how the production of scientific knowledge is a local production, and it is not the same everywhere in the world, and that when we treat STEM knowledge as uniform in the mode in which most Elsevier journals publish it, we are excluding not just makers of knowledge, which we are, but also kinds of knowledge, the kinds of questions and the importance. So the bad news is that it's very hard. I mean, we've talked about the funding problem, that this notion, the idea of international collections that I'm pushing is ever more expansive, which makes it ever more costly. And I acknowledge that, and I don't have a solution to it. But I think that an ethical global collection, has to include scientific, medical, other STEM forms of research, genuinely from around the world, and that this is sometimes a challenge to our colleagues who run those science libraries, because they're dealing with finite budgets as well, and they're at least in many cases their patrons aren't demanding. In my case, say Chinese medical journals, but that knowledge landscape is bigger than just what their immediate patrons are clamoring for.
Thank you both. I'm going to tee up our next question here from Kauko. Thank you for your interesting lecture. 2 questions. 1, are there specific recommendations from the ICCG survey results which have been prioritized, discussed, or acted upon by the CSPC or the board? And if so, could you please share those with us? Can you share with us the need for yet another survey or consultancy group's work to move us forward? Are there specific areas where clarity is not achieved yet? And 2, given the valuable post-colonial angle CRL wishes to embark on, are there any considerations to bring in international partners, cultural groups from colonized societies that CRL is planning to bring within the community in a more robust way?
Yeah, sure. I'll just jump in. So so one of the things that that's a huge challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity, is building a when it comes to CRL and our approach to building global collections, is really building a structure so that we can build a stronger systems awareness, so that we can build, so we can collectively sort of come together and have a series of dialogues to collectively expand our understanding of the field of play. And so one of the great, honors of being in my job is going around and being able to talk to different stakeholders, talking to deans, talking to staff, listening with folks in the different AMP groups, and really, getting a sense of, what are the conversations, what does the world look like from the vantage points of these different stakeholder groups. And one of the things that maybe the most profound takeaway I have is that these stakeholder groups only have a very they're not talking enough. And I think Lisa Carter said it yesterday. We need dialogue, 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 dialogue. And what we need from this Educopia process, but we haven't achieved clarity yet, right? Like why would we need like another survey? Why do we need like another focus group? Why do we need like yet another consultant? Like believe me, if I didn't believe it was necessary, I wouldn't do it. Like I get it too. I want to get on with the work. I totally get that. But based on what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing when I talk with folks across the stakeholder group, is that the different stakeholders don't know about each other. And so from where I'm looking at, there's a large field of play, but we need to come together across the AMP groups, across staff, and across deans to build a more community level understanding of what the opportunity space is, and then design something there. And this is going to be super challenging, but it's also going to be a super opportunity. So there's a Mark Twain quote that I think is really, really helpful. And Mark, the quote is, "It isn't what you know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know that isn't so that gets you in trouble." And this is something where experts, if you're a real expert, you can fall prey to this, right? Because what you know, you really, really know. You're an expert, right? But when you're an expert in one area, that's the domain knowledge. You may not understand the whole field of play. You may not realize that there's a larger system at play. And when it comes to CRL's global collections work, we really need to have a process. I mean, facilitated by a consultant or not, we need to have a process to bring different stakeholder groups in conversation together so we can build a systems understanding of what the landscape looks like. And again, I've gone and talked to different stakeholder groups, and their view of the world is completely valid and completely correct. But there's a larger system at play, and we want to come together and get a systems understanding so we can design something at the system level.
Greg, maybe here this is a good moment also to thinking, so we get to the specificities, to bring in James Simon's question, which I think will help in this vein, what the opportunities are for broad community input into the Educopia process. Because I think this goes hand in hand with what you're saying about all the different stakeholders understanding each other.
Yeah. I have a question here from Doug Way, former head of collections at Wisconsin, dean at Kentucky, former collections and policy committee member. I think it's a question for you, Brian. Could you talk a little bit about how a new model could bring greater depth and breadth of global collections while also leveraging coordination and efficiencies, that CRL could bring? That's probably a question for both of us. I just threw it to you.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to allocate your resources, Greg. That's easy. The way that the way I've been thinking about, I've been thinking this is a couple of ways. I guess the core of my understanding, and obviously I don't work at CRL, and I actually don't want to make claims on the people there, but I think that CRL is particularly interesting in that it, I see it operating in three different domains. There's CRL's own collections and what their staff and materials do. There are the things that CRL sponsors and creates a platform for. So the AMPs are an obvious example of that, but there are others. And I think in our community, we've really depended on CRL to be that agent that allows us to come together with a solid, secure institutional home. And I know others are looking to it now in this vein. But there's also this coordinating role that CRL offers, a kind of leadership across the field more broadly. And I think this is the hardest challenge. And to Doug's question, CRL itself can't compensate for a drop in breadth of collections in the institutions that make up our broader collections ecosystem. That we really do all have to work together. This does require individual investments, and especially not just in terms of collections, but in terms of people. One of the themes that's really come out of the ICC group's thinking has been what deep expertise among our librarians and our paraprofessionals and all the people that go into our libraries, what that means for good, cosmopolitan, rich institutions and an active community of people doing international and area studies librarianship. So I guess to this question, I don't yet have a model for how to do that, but those are the factors that I think they're in play if we're going to bring greater depth and breadth. Greg and I have talked about this, for many years, long before he came to CRL. And I think part of that is, goes beyond just the collecting, but also, how do we build platforms to support the kinds of scholarship that's happening in our institutions? What are the things that CRL can do that individual institution can't, but that we can do together? So, kind of building on the things that things like the AMPs have done well, but doing them at these are things I think are scalable. We can do them at a broader scale. We can coordinate those efforts, reduce reduplication of effort in some regards, but also kind of do more with some of these organic efforts that many of our individual communities have done around things like distributed collaborative collection development or building entire repositories. I mean, SAWA again has inspired a great many of us. And the ICC group specifically has also been interested in doing this kind of work around open access. What does a truly global open access movement look like? And what's the role that CRL and our institutions can play? Now I'm rambling, so I'll stop.
No. So I'll jump in super quickly because we're, sort of running short on time, but I think this conversation and the comments that I'm reading really underscores for me that we need to have an in-person event to really bring everyone here and have conversations together. Doug Way, James Simon, Carol. So we need to get everyone here so we can have this conversation. But just going really quickly, James, it's good to see you. I miss you. So the Educopia, there's going to be lots of calls for forums and engagement. And so we're going to have a series of open town halls over the next several months. So there's going to be lots of opportunity to have open conversations. So definitely look forward to that. Sarah Pritchard, I've got to answer it. Sarah asked a question, got to answer it. So Sarah, that's a really good point. This is something where I was in San Diego last week, and I had a really terrific conversation with Scott Walter, at the library dean at San Diego State, San Diego, and he really talked about how the campus priority at San Diego State is really focused on globalization across the board, not in terms of just the library, but globalization in terms of pedagogy, foreign exchange, all sorts of campus-wide efforts. And he talked about San Diego's participation in this ACE facilitated process, which admittedly I don't know much about. Scott was getting it on my mental map, but I know Scott talked really persuasively about his work at San Diego aligning the library's globalization international efforts with priorities campus-wide. And then Scott, I really need him to answer this, but really talked about this ACE-led process that is taking place on other campuses. I think UCLA may be another one. So it could be that some campuses are divesting from that global focus, but presumably many more are focused on our students in the world. That's a real focus at Macalester. Angie Fakes is on the board of directors and library director at Macalester. I visited Macalester, and a Macalester education and really making sure that students have a global mindset is a real focus. So I think that mileage could vary in different institutional contexts. So maybe some institutions are moving away from global investments, but presumably many more, and hopefully more are moving in that direction. Felicia, there are other questions. I'm cognizant that there's probably many more things we can talk about, and
certainly running short, I know, and I thank both of you for jumping in as you see the through lines in these different questions, and we were seeing that on our side as well. There's quite a bit of overlap in what you all are interested in. So perhaps as a last question from Ksenia, area studies are transnational and global in terms of their colonial experiences. For example, in Eastern Europe, one needs to ground research from the bottom up, the languages of the people of a territory or their diaspora, refugees fleeing authoritarianism, but also from the bottom down. the empires that have ruled over them. Linguistic expertise in Polish, German, Russian, Turkish, Swedish, and local languages can all come to play in research. This is probably true of other areas. How might a new CRL AMP model support the complexities of regional and linguistic research without losing the diversity of local voices in re-colonial movements, such as Russia?
I guess I'll jump in to say that I don't have a ton to add to. I tried to address some of this earlier, and I hope that's somewhat satisfactory. In terms of model building, I think that there are two ways I've been thinking about this. In part, I think within our communities we're doing this somewhat organically. When I look at the interest in diasporic collecting, that seems to be a trend among librarians over the last couple of decades, that we're doing more of that than we did in the past, and to good effect. I was trying to think, this is there are those occasions of languages and cultural products that seem out of place from one perspective, but are completely in place when you think about flows and connections across places. And I think that we as a whole are being more cognizant of that. I think that also in terms of making connections among areas that are vested in particular kinds of collecting, there are also advantages there in terms of helping convince each other, whether that's thinking about Russian materials in China, or or whether it's actively colonial languages that I think we can incorporate into the structures that we build.
And this has been, we're going to have a meeting in person and get everyone here and have a robust conversation. But I do see a couple of questions, and I want to try to answer all of them. So Carol, who's the chair of the Slavic group, he says, hey, what specifically is a challenge in terms of capacity or operations with the different groups? And I'm going to get super operational for a second, but operations matter. There are different flavors of it, but the invoicing workflow alone is the overhead for invoicing alone has brought the accounting department to their knees. And I can get into I'm not going to talk more in detail about that, but that's one specific example. And then Michael Brewer, going to sort of a different, going from the operations to high level advocacy. Could CRL use its platform to advocate for changes in how Title VI funding is conceived and allocated? Yeah, Michael, absolutely. That's exactly the field of play CRL should be on. And I would love to use the scale of CRL to do exactly that kind of work. So there's much more to talk about, but I didn't want to leave that comment unaddressed. You're exactly right, as you often are, Michael. we need to have you out here and have, I need to have you on this panel. But it's just great to have this conversation, everyone. I know we're running out of time, and out of respect, I just want to thank everyone for being here. Brian, it's great to see you. Thank you for sharing the group. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement. And Felicia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you both so much, Greg and Brian, for being here. And thank you to all of you who have joined us and shared your questions. This has been such a phenomenal conversation. I just want to remind everyone, as our next step in this Educopia process, we will have a community convening at the end of May where we will invite everyone to come together, and Educopia will share updates from the first steps in this process and where we'll be going next. So if you're interested and engaged in these questions, I encourage you to join us. We'll have more information on the website soon about the exact date and time for that event. But in the meantime, thank you both again so much. And Greg, I want to give you some space if you have any final thoughts to leave us with as we close out today.
Well, I think that I'll just say that the future is incredibly bright, and it's not bright because of some theoretical vision. Research libraries have been building the foundation, the institutional foundation for the knowledge commons for the last 60 years. We just get together and we just take stock of where we are and keep moving forward. The future is definitely bright. Thank you for being here. Have great weekends, everyone. Thank you.